Good morning. It's great to be with you all in this virtual sense. I wish I could see your faces, but I know they're there. And please be assured that I do continue to pray for you. I was reading something this week, I'm not quite sure where, but it said that for most prisoners in the country now, they are locked in their cells for 23 hours and 20 minutes of every day, which is a grim thought indeed. It's also, of course, impossible to socially distance in the narrow corridors of a prison. So might be something you want to hold in your prayers this week. But I say that at the beginning of my my message to you today because I'm guessing that for many of us, we're feeling a bit trapped. Maybe the thought of what those prisoners are going through will make us feel a little less trapped, but it doesn't always work like that, does it? But today we begin a series on the book of Philippians. And James and I have chosen Philippians to go through in this season because Philippians was written from prison. Philippians was written by Paul to the church in Philippi, obviously, from probably a Roman prison. Now, we know that Paul was in prison a number of times in his life. He was in prison in Philippi itself, actually, in what sounds like a very grim situation where he was shackled. And we also know that he was in prison in Caesarea in Palestine for quite a long period of time. He was in prison in Rome for a long period of time. And that we think there were some other instances as well. But this one is so that we're not quite sure which prison he was in when he wrote to the church in Philippi, but probably a Roman prison. And so we just felt it was a really appropriate thing to be looking at this time, to be looking at what Paul is thinking about when he's stuck in prison, can't get out, looking at his relationship with those that he can't see and can't be with. And there's so much, I mean, I'm sure you know this letter and probably love it already, but there is so much in this letter, but it seems to us that it may resonate with a fresh power in these days, or in a new power. We might hear new, different things in these days than we have heard before. So we will have just heard it read, I imagine, as the service has been put together. So I'm not going to reread it, but let me say one preliminary thing first. I don't know if you have ever been caught out with a cut and paste error. I have been, unfortunately, sometimes. You know, when you're sending out perhaps something like a Christmas letter or a letter you're sending to lots of people and you want it to sound personal, so you write that kind of nice chatty middle bit that you're going to send to everybody, and then you copy it and you cut and paste the top and the bottom to make it personal. And you want each person to feel like they've received an individual letter to themselves. And then you copy the whole thing and you accidentally leave the wrong name in when you send it out, or you accidentally leave the wrong information in there, or something that gives it away that this has been copied and pasted, and oh no, it completely backfires that impression you'd wanted to give of being personal, and just it suddenly looks like a forgery. I don't know if you've ever been caught out that way. Of course, I couldn't possibly say if it's ever happened to me. But the thing about the letter of Philippians, obviously there's no such thing as copy and paste in those days. But the thing about that is that this carries absolutely no sense of that. This is Paul writing with deep affection to people that he loved very much indeed. And he doesn't do things quite the same way as he does with some of the other letters, partly because he wants to make a particular point, and also partly, I think, just out of the affection that he has for this church in Philippi, who, Philippi really was the first place that the gospel lodged in Europe after he crossed over from Troas in modern Turkey. He had this vision of a man of Macedonia, of course, modern Greece, as we would think about it, and saying, come over here, we need the gospel here as well. And he went across, and the first place really that he came to was Philippi, and he went to the river there and he met Lydia, and she was converted in her household, and eventually he was chucked into prison, and a whole load of stuff happened in Philippi. There's a lot of backstory with these people. But when he had to move on, he left half his heart behind with them. And he took their heart with him as well, because They'd heard he was in prison. They'd sent money to help support him while he was in prison. In those days, a prisoner didn't get their board paid for. They had to rely on friends or family to support them. And the Philippian church had sent money to help support Paul. And they'd sent it with someone called Epaphroditus. And he'd got sick either on the way to Paul or on the way back from Paul. I'm not quite clear, but he'd got very, very sick. And then the Philippian church were worried about him as well as Paul. And then Epaphroditus heard that the Philippian church, or knew that the Philippian church anyway, would be worried about him. And then he was worried about them. And it's a rather lovely story of kind of mutual care and concern. And so Paul, Epaphroditus was supposed to be staying with Paul for a while to help look after him while he was in prison, but Paul really wants to get a letter to the church, and Epaphroditus really wants to let the church know that he's okay. And so he comes back rather sooner than planned, bearing this letter, which contains Paul's love, some advice from Paul, some words of encouragement from Paul, and thanks for the money that they had sent. So it is anything but a cut and paste letter. It is a letter written to people that he deeply loves. And there are three things that I want to show you from this letter. And they relate, I guess, all to the one idea that Paul is stuck. I don't know what his circumstances were like. I think prisons varied hugely in the ancient world. I think the prison, as I mentioned, that he was in Philippi was pretty grim. In Rome, if Paul was in Rome, he seems to have had slightly better conditions. He may have been under house arrest, so he may not have been underground and chained, but whatever his circumstances, he was trapped within a building with 4 walls to look at. And yet he sees beyond that. And that's the key thing that joins the 3 things I want to show you from this passage. He sees beyond the place that he's locked into. And there are 3 things that he is able to see. And the first one is this. This is not all there is. His world has not collapsed down to these 4 walls. And it could do very well. Something that we see, isn't it? When people are facing a great trial one way or another, as Paul is, it's very easy, and very often we see that their worlds kind of collapse inwards, and they become only preoccupied with their own concerns. It's entirely understandable. But Paul is bigger than that, and his world has not collapsed inwards. There's one of the other letters he says, who's in trouble and I'm not burning it with concern for them and praying for them. He's constantly thinking of those places he's left behind, of those friends he has left behind, of those people he loves and cannot be with. So this is his first thing. This is my bedroom I'm sitting in at the moment. This is not all that there is. There is more beyond these 4 walls, and I remember that, and I know that, and I love the people who are beyond these 4 walls. How do we know that he loves the church in Philippi? Listen to these words again. I'm reading from a slightly different version because it's the one I have at home in my hand. So I'm reading from the ESV, but listen to these words again. They'll be similar enough to the New Revised Standard. I thank my God in all my remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine for you, in making my prayer with joy, because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now. Skipping on to verse 7, it's right for me to feel this way about you all, because I hold you in my heart, for you are all partakers with me of grace. Skipping on, verse 8, for God is my witness, how I yearn for you all with the affection of Christ. This is not a cut and paste letter, is it? These are words written out of true love. I thank my God in all my remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine for you all, making my prayer with joy. because of your partnership in the gospel. He thanks God for what he remembers about them. He thanks God for what they are continuing to do in sending Epaphroditus and in sending the money. He thanks God because he hears that the church is doing well broadly, and we're going to hear about more about that in weeks to come. He thanks God because of their willing acceptance of the good news of Jesus. He thanks God when he remembers that church, that those people that heard the message and responded to it. He thanks God when he remembers his friends, the loved ones he's left behind. Because I hold you in my heart, he says, for you are all partakers with me of grace. What does he mean by that? Partakers with me of grace. Something about being sharers in the gospel, I think. Possibly also something about the financial assistance that they've given, that they have shared of their own, actually not wealth. They weren't a wealthy church, but they've shared out of what they had with him. How I yearn for you all with the affection of Christ. These are powerful words, and these are words that probably resonate very much with us. I've heard from people this week saying how much we are missing one another, how much we're missing seeing one another's faces, how much we long to be back together again. I cannot tell you how moved I was when I led communion that last Sunday before lockdown, and I was pretty sure at that point that it would be our last Sunday before lockdown. And as I stood there, and it is such a privilege to preside at the Lord's table anyway, and as I stood there at the communion table that day and looked around and thought, when will I see you again? And how will we be in the meantime? And I cannot tell you how moved I was when we had our last deacons meeting the following day in the church, and we sat in the foyer at distance from one another. And it was the last time we were physically together, and James actually was self-isolating at that point, so he was on a laptop and the rest of us were sitting around in the foyer, and we prayed together, and we shared the grace at the end, and then we left and we turned out the lights, and it was so strange and disorientating and painful, and I don't need to tell you that, because I know that you're feeling much the same thing as that. But what we are feeling, what we are experiencing in this time of longing to be back together, longing to be able to see one another face to face, we're experiencing something of what Paul is feeling for the Philippian church here, and he refuses to allow his world to collapse down to what he can see in his four walls. He knows this is not all there is, and out there is that church that I love, those people that I love in Philippi. And I thank my God for you all, he says, whenever I remember you. And I pray for you constantly, and my heart yearns for you because I hold you in my heart. So this is the first thing that we learn in this lesson. We're going to take a short break, listen to a piece of music, just to think about that, and then I'm going to show you the other 2 points. The music we're going to listen to is that well-known hymn, "In Christ There Is No East or West." And I've tried very hard to find the ragtime tune that we have sung it to a few times in church, because it's great. And I could only find it being played, apparently it's quite a good banjo tune, and there's a lot of banjo players out there picking their way through it with various degrees of expertise. But I couldn't find, I could only find it being sung in one place as well as the music, and then we didn't have the words. So I've chosen a different version, and I hope that this will be meaningful for you. So let's just think together of one another, maybe pray for one another as we listen to this, but also remember that the church is bigger than even just the 100 or so of us. And so we'll worship God as we listen to this music, maybe join in with this music, and then I want to share a couple more thoughts in just a moment after that.